Welcome back to Smile and Scars, the place where real moments collide with unexpected turns, where one simple question can change a life forever. Today's story begins on a cold city street, with a man everyone thought they understood, and another man no one truly did. It was early evening when Steven Seagal stepped out of the black SUV. The city buzzed around him, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement after a light rain. People noticed him immediately. Some whispered his name, others pulled out their phones. To most, he was a legend, an action star, a man known for strength, discipline, and an intimidating presence that demanded space. Steven had just finished a private meeting nearby. He wasn't in a rush, he rarely was. His movements were calm, controlled, deliberate. Years of martial arts training had shaped not only his body, but the way he carried himself through the world. Across the street, sitting near the entrance of a closed coffee shop, was a homeless man. His jacket was thin, his shoes worn down to the soles. His beard was untrimmed, his face marked by years of hardship. People walked past him all day without seeing him. Some avoided eye contact. Others pretended he wasn't there at all. The man watched Steven approach. He didn't recognize him at first. To him, Steven was just another well-dressed man walking with confidence. The homeless man hesitated. Asking for help always came with rejection, sometimes with insults, sometimes with silence that hurt more than words. As Steven passed by, the man gathered what little courage he had left. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice cracked. "Can you give me $1? Just $1, not 10, not 20. Just enough for a cup of coffee or a piece of bread." Steven stopped. The street noise seemed to soften for a moment. People nearby slowed their steps, sensing something unusual. Steven turned and looked directly at the man, not over him, not past him, at him. The homeless man lowered his eyes, already expecting the answer he'd heard 1,000 times before. Steven didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't shake his head. He didn't walk away. Instead, he asked a question. "Why do you need it?" The man looked up, surprised. No one ever asked that. They either gave or refused. Usually refused. "I'm hungry," the man said honestly and cold. Steven studied him carefully. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. He noticed the way the man's hands trembled, the stiffness in his posture, the exhaustion etched into his face. Steven then said something that shocked not only the homeless man, but everyone watching. "I'm not going to give you $1. A few people nearby scoffed quietly. Another rich man refusing to help. Another disappointment. The homeless man nodded slowly, already bracing himself for humiliation. But Steven wasn't finished. "I'm going to give you something else," he continued. The man looked up again, confused. Steven glanced around, then gestured toward a small diner across the street. Still open, warm light glowing through its windows. "Get up," Steven said calmly. "You're coming with me." The homeless man froze. Fear flickered across his face. Years on the street had taught him to be cautious. Offers that sounded too good often came with strings attached. "I don't want trouble," the man said quietly. Steven smiled just slightly. "Neither do I." After a moment, the man slowly stood. His legs shook from the cold and fatigue. Steven waited, unhurried, as if this moment mattered more than anything else he had planned that evening. They crossed the street together. Inside the diner, the warmth hit immediately. The smell of coffee and fresh food filled the air. Conversations hushed as people recognized Steven Seagal walking in with a homeless man beside him. Steven ignored the stares. "Sit," he told the man, pulling out a booth seat. The man hesitated, then sat, his eyes wide as if he were afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. Steven sat across from him. The waitress approached, clearly nervous. "Mr. Seagal, what can I get you?" Steven didn't even look at the menu. "Bring him the biggest meal you have, hot coffee, and whatever he wants after that." The homeless man opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The waitress nodded quickly and rushed off. For a few seconds neither man spoke. Then Steven broke the silence. "What's your name?" The man swallowed. "David." "How long have you been out here, David?" David hesitated, then answered. Almost 6 years. Stephen leaned back slightly. What happened? David looked down at the table, his hands clenched together. Life, he said. It just fell apart. Stephen didn't push. He waited. After a moment, David continued. I had a job, a family, then my wife got sick. Medical bills. I lost my job taking care of her. When she passed, I couldn't keep up anymore. Everything went downhill. Stephen listened without interrupting. No judgment, no pity, just attention. The food arrived quickly. Plates piled high with hot meals. David stared at them like they weren't real. Eat, Stephen said simply. David did, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Tears slipped down his face as he chewed, embarrassed but unable to stop. Stephen let him eat in silence. People around them whispered. Phones came out. A few recorded discreetly. But something about Stephen's presence kept the moment grounded, protected. When David finally finished, he leaned back, exhausted but warmer, fuller than he had been in years. Stephen reached into his pocket then. He pulled out a folded bill and placed it on the table. David looked at it and froze. It wasn't $1, it was much more. David shook his head. Sir, I can't take this. Stephen met his eyes. You already did, he said, by standing up, by walking in here, by being honest. David's hands trembled as he picked up the money. Stephen wasn't done yet. Money helps for a day, he said, maybe a week, but it doesn't fix what's broken. David looked confused again. Stephen slid a card across the table. Tomorrow morning, go to this address, Stephen said. Ask for the man whose name is on that card. Tell him I sent you. David stared at the card like it was a lifeline. What is it? He asked. A chance. Stephen replied. Outside, the city continued its noise. Inside the diner, something had shifted. David had asked for $1. What Stephen gave him was something far bigger. And what would happen next would shock everyone who thought this was just another celebrity moment. This was only the beginning. David didn't sleep much that night. The warmth of the diner still clung to his skin, but his mind refused to settle. The card Stephen had given him lay folded carefully in his pocket, as if it might disappear if he touched it too often. For years, mornings had meant waking up on concrete, bracing for another day of invisibility, but this morning felt different. Dangerous even. Hope had a way of hurting worse than hunger if it turned out to be false. As the sun rose, David stood outside the address on the card. It wasn't a shelter, it wasn't a church. It was a modest training facility tucked between two warehouses. The windows were clean, the door was solid. A small sign hung above it, simple and unassuming. David hesitated. He adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how he must look. He nearly turned away, but then he remembered the way Stephen had looked at him. Not like a problem, not like a charity case, like a man. David pushed the door open. Inside, the smell of clean mats and fresh coffee filled the air. A few people trained quietly in the background, their movements controlled and focused. Conversations stopped when they noticed David standing there, uncertain and out of place. A tall man approached him, calm, alert. Can I help you? The man asked. David swallowed. Steven Seagal sent me. The man's expression changed instantly. What's your name? He asked. David. The man nodded once. Follow me. No questions, no hesitation. David was led into a small office. The walls were covered with photos. Stephen stood in several of them, younger, older, always the same steady presence. The man gestured for David to sit. You hungry? He asked. David nodded. Food appeared again. Simple, warm, real. As David ate, the man watched quietly. Stephen called this morning. The man said, he said you'd come. He said you're not lazy. He said you're not broken, just knocked down. David froze mid-bite. His eyes burned. The man continued. Here's how this works. You train, you clean up. You show up every day. In return, you get a place to stay, food, and a chance to earn real work. No handouts, no pity. David nodded again, unable to speak. That was how it started. The first weeks were brutal. David's body wasn't ready for the discipline. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned. Some days, he wanted to quit before the sun even set. But something kept him going. Not the food, not the bed. It was the respect. No one looked down on him. No one asked about his past unless he offered it. They called him by his name. Steven visited occasionally, never announced, never dramatic. He'd watch quietly from the corner, correcting a stance here, offering a few words there. When he spoke to David, it was never about saving him. It was about responsibility. One step at a time, Steven told him once. You fall, you get up. That's life. Months passed. David's beard was trimmed. His posture straightened. His hands stopped shaking. He began helping newer arrivals, men who reminded him painfully of who he used to be. One evening after training, Steven sat beside him. You ever think about going back to your old field? Steven asked. David nodded slowly. I was a mechanic. Steven smiled faintly. Good. There's someone I want you to meet. The next day, David found himself standing inside a real garage. Tools lined the walls, engines hummed. The owner, an older man with grease-stained hands, shook David's hand firmly. He's with me, Steven said. Give him a shot. The owner studied David for a long moment. You show up on time, you work hard, you stay clean. That's all I care about. David worked harder than he ever had. Weeks turned into months again. His hands regained their skill. His confidence grew quietly, not loudly. He saved every dollar he earned. Then came the day that changed everything again. David was walking past the same coffee shop where he had once sat, cold and invisible. Another man sat there now. Younger, same hollow look in his eyes. The man looked up and asked, Hey, can you spare $1? David stopped. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. David reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out money. He pulled out a card, an address, a chance. The man stared at it, confused. Go there tomorrow, David said. Tell them I sent you. The man blinked. Why are you helping me? David smiled. Because someone once did the same for me. Word spread quietly. Not online, not through headlines. Through lives changed one at a time. Steven never spoke about it publicly. He never posted, never claimed credit. But people noticed the pattern, men disappearing from the streets and reappearing with purpose. One night, months later, David stood in front of a mirror in a small apartment, his apartment. He adjusted his jacket, heart pounding. Steven had invited him to dinner, not as charity, as equals. At the table, Steven raised his glass. You didn't need me, Steven said calmly. You needed a door. David shook his head. You didn't give me money. You gave me dignity. Steven nodded once. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of how close David had once been to vanishing entirely. He had asked for $1. The response had shocked him, but what came after would change not just his life, but many others, and the final moment, the one no one expected, was still ahead. The invitation arrived quietly. No envelope stamped with importance, no formal wording, just a message passed through Steven's assistant, asking David to stop by the training facility one evening after work. David felt the old nerves return as he stood outside the familiar building. This place had rebuilt him piece by piece. He wondered why Steven wanted to see him now. Inside, the lights were dimmer than usual. Training mats were rolled away. Chairs were set up in neat rows. A handful of people stood talking softly. David recognized some of them. Men who had once slept on sidewalks, men who now stood straighter, spoke clearer, lived fuller. Steven stood near the front. When he saw David, he nodded. Good, Steven said. You're on time. David smiled nervously. I always am. Steven gestured for him to sit in the front row. As David took his seat, he realized something else. There were business owners in the room, counselors, instructors, people who looked like they belonged to systems David had once been shut out of completely. Steven stepped forward. I don't like speeches, he said, so I'll keep this short. The room fell silent. People think the problem is money, Steven continued. It's not. It's direction. It's discipline. It's someone seeing you before you disappear. Steven paused, then looked directly at David. This man asked me for $1. A quiet murmur moved through the room. I didn't give it to him, Steven said, because I wanted to see if he'd take responsibility for the rest. David's throat tightened. Steven turned back to the group. What you're about to see isn't charity, it's accountability. The lights shifted. A screen behind Steven came to life, showing photos. Not dramatic, not polished, just moments. David training, David working, David helping others. David standing beside men who looked exactly like he once had. Steven motioned for David to stand. David's legs felt heavy as he rose. "This is your room," Steven said. "Tell them." David swallowed hard. He hadn't planned words. He hadn't rehearsed anything. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I didn't need saving," David said. "I needed someone to stop lying to me." People leaned forward. "On the street, you're told you're invisible," David continued. "Or worse, that you deserve it. Steven didn't tell me I was special. He told me to stand up, to work, to show up. That changed everything." A man in the back wiped his eyes. David looked at Steven. "You asked me once if I'd help someone else when the time came." "I have, more than once," Steven nodded. "That's why you're here," Steven said. He turned to the group again. "We're expanding," Steven announced. "More locations, more partnerships, but I'm not running them." The room stirred. Steven placed a hand on David's shoulder. "He is." David's breath caught. "I'm not famous," Steven said. "I don't walk the streets anymore, but he does. He understands them. He speaks their language." David shook his head. "I'm not ready." Steven leaned closer. "You weren't ready when you walked into that diner either." Laughter broke the tension. That night marked the beginning of something bigger than either of them had planned. Months passed in a blur of responsibility. David now spent his days splitting time between the garage, the facility, and the streets he once knew too well. He spoke to men who didn't trust promises, men who flinched at kindness. He never preached. He never begged. He offered doors some walked through, some didn't. He learned quickly that you couldn't save everyone. And that was okay. One evening, after a long day, David sat alone on a bench near the same coffee shop where everything had begun. The city lights flickered on. Footsteps echoed. A familiar voice spoke behind him. "Cold night." David turned. Steven stood there, hands in his coat pockets. David smiled. "You still sneak up on people." Steven smirked. "Old habit." They sat in silence for a moment. "You did good," Steven said finally. David shook his head. "We did." Steven nodded. A man approached hesitantly. He looked at Steven, then at David. "Excuse me," the man said. "Can you spare $1?" David looked at Steven. Steven raised an eyebrow, amused. "Your call." David stood. He faced the man. "What's your name?" David asked. The man blinked. "Eric." David smiled. "I don't have $1 for you." Eric's shoulders slumped. "But, David continued, "I might have something better." Steven watched quietly as David spoke, recognizing the moment for what it was. A cycle breaking, a hand reaching back. As they walked away together, Steven slowed his steps, letting David lead. Later that night, Steven returned home alone. He stood by the window, watching the city. He thought about how many people had asked him for money over the years. How easy it would have been to say yes and walk away. He was glad he hadn't, because sometimes the most shocking response isn't giving. It's believing, and all it took to change everything was one man asking for $1, and another man refusing to give it. Thank you for watching Smile and Scars, where every scar has a story and every smile has a cost.